Hello everyone, welcome back to History 103. In this lecture, we will look at the skirmish at Picacho Pass, focusing on Arizona's history during the Civil War. So the title is called Arizona and the Creation of a Confederate Myth. Just so you know, Arizona did participate somewhat in the American Civil War. It was known as the most kind of Western battle of this national conflict. And for the most part, it was controlled by the Union, right? We were a Union, really a pro Union territory. But by the 1950s, as you can see in this image, somehow we became Southern, right? And this image kind of showcases that when they were celebrating the centennial of the U.S. Civil War, somehow Arizona began to represent itself kind of like in that Southern um, perspective, and you can see kind of like Southern bells and all that type of stuff. And one would think that this is South Carolina, but in actuality it's Tucson, Arizona. So as you can see right here, right at a gala. So many of you are probably familiar with the many battles and events of the U.S. Civil War, and some probably know of what took place here in Arizona. Though there was not much action in the West, our state did somewhat participate in this national issue. But the post historical impact might be more important, really more interesting than the actual quote unquote battle, due to the fact that the power of memory reshaped how we viewed the Battle of Picacho Pass. As with any other issue, many of us like to put ourselves within the context of major events, even though our role might be minimal at best. The same could be said about the fight at Picacho Pass. Arizona really wasn't that important to the overall narrative of the US Civil War. However, if you were to ask someone alive in the 1950s about our state's participation, one would think that this quote unquote battle was the determining factor, right? In this lecture, we will explore what took place here and how decades later the narrative of the battle was shaped by a Confederate fantasy heritage that was created out of thin air. So here you see a picture. This is the picture that was kind of touched up by a community member, and you can see the Confederate flag flying in somewhere in downtown Phoenix. There is an actual picture of the Confederate flag flying on the state capitol around this period, which is around the 1960s. So again, one would think that Arizona was a southern state, or at the very minimum, a southern territory, but that couldn't be further from the truth. So the question is, how did we go from Union to all of a sudden representing ourselves as a southern territory? So let's look at the objectives. Number one, we're going to explain Arizona's politics in the 1860s that led to the skirmish at Picacho Pass. So, why was Arizona involved in this event? And again, to say it was involved is a bit of a stretch, but again, you do have unions and you do have Confederates and so forth. So we'll explain that. We'll address the post-Civil War period, focusing on memory and monuments developed by the Confederate organization. So right now there's a lot of debate, right? The last couple of years about having monuments out in public spaces, and some people are against them while other people are for them, and some people see it as, well, it's part of our history. And this is a great example of not really, but we'll address what happened here. And I always tell students, a monument doesn't tell you history. Read a book. That's probably much more valuable than looking at a statue. But our current culture is just kind of funny. And then lastly, we're going to challenge the myth that Arizona was a Confederate territory. So again, this is the problem with monuments, is that it's very misleading, because most of these monuments come decades, here almost a century after the event, and it really whitewashes the actual history itself. So we're going to address what happened and challenge that idea that has been perpetuated since the post 1950s period. All right, so let's look at what took place here in Arizona. So first, let's explore what took place and understand why this territory was even included in Civil War scholarship. As you are well aware, after the US-Mexico War, the West, specifically Arizona, became a territory bunched in with New Mexico. There was nothing here, and the most important centers were in Tucson, in Tucson and Yuma at that time. So how did Arizona get entangled in this national conflict then? First, we must understand the political culture that existed here before the war. So after the US-Mexico War is what we're going to be looking at here. So in the early 1860s, Arizona was divided between Unionists, Territorialists, and Confederates. So you probably never heard who the Territorialists were because it's never really ever talked about. So here we're focusing on Arizona. So most of you are familiar with who were the Confederates and who were the Unionists. But who were these Territorialists? So these are people that are living here in Arizona, in the Arizona Territory. Well, this group aligned itself more with the South. However, they wanted to create a separate territory in Arizona that included the southern portion of modern-day Arizona and New Mexico. So these territorialists sought, quote, self-determination and protection, unquote, as they felt that the little government that existed in the West did not protect them against Native Americans or other forms of lawlessness. So these territorialists weren't concerned with slavery. But since they outnumbered the Confederates needed their support in order to achieve their goal. So again, these territorialists, who were the dominant group, had nothing to do with slavery or even cared about some of these issues. So since Arizona was located in the South, Confederates from Texas felt that this territory was automatically theirs since it was an avenue to the Pacific Ocean and had access to minerals such as gold, which could help fund their war efforts. But since they were few in numbers, they needed the support of the territorialists. After 4 years of territorial petitioning, they felt that their only option was to join forces with the Confederates. And in March of 1861, Arizona petitioned to join the Confederacy, and by August, quote, August 1861, 68 settlers met in Tucson and resolved to send a representative to the Confederate Congress, unquote. Unionists from Tucson quickly moved out to California as a Texan Confederacy company reached Tucson in February 1862 and took over the city. So this Arizona Territory was pro-Union, but in 1862 it became a Confederate territory, I guess. Though this might sound like it was a massive march west by the Confederacy, in fact, this company was composed mostly of Captain Sherrod Hunter and about 100 men, with half being from Arizona Territory already, not from Texas. So it wasn't this massive march coming from Texas to take over Arizona. The Confederate flag did fly in Tucson, but within a few months, it was gone. So let's examine what took place in this infamous battle. As the Confederates took over Tucson, Union troops in California geared up to move east and retake the town. Captain William McLeave, he's a Union guy, took a few men from the 2,300-man California column and, quote, rode out of Fort Yuma and headed up to Gila, unquote. Hunter, who was a Confederate, headed out of Tucson and moved northwest to the Pima village near the Gila River, where he, quote, captured McLeave and 9 Union privates without firing a shot, unquote. Returning to Tucson, Hunter set up a picket post, which was a small number of defensive troops at Picacho Pass, which was commanded by Sergeant Henry Holmes, a Southern Arizona pioneer. So this is where, again, the whole battle really begins to take shape. As quote-unquote battle, right? As word spread west to Colonel James H. Carleton, he commanded Captain William P. Calloway to take troops into Tucson, recapture the city and rebels, and, quote, rescue McLeave and intercept Colonel Riley on his return from Sonora, unquote. With commands now set, we get to explore what took place in this infamous event. Though there were no written records on that day of what actually took place, we do have a pretty good indication that it wasn't a major event that most of us have been told. In fact, one could argue that it wasn't even a footnote to really be remembered. So here you see the where these battle or quote unquote battles were taking shape, right? And California, for the most part, was a Union state, and like I said, Tucson was controlled by the Confederates for a short window. So what happened on April 15th, 1962? As the story goes, Lieutenant James Barrett, with quote 12 volunteers and a scout, surprised 10 rebel posted to watch the road north of Tucson, unquote. The entire skirmish had no more than 25 men altogether. However, as the years passed and more people told the tale, those numbers became exaggerated. So according to Captain Calloway, Barrett, quote, led his men into the thicket single file without dismounting them. After being requested twice by Mr. Jones, who was a scout for the Union, to do so. The first fire from the enemy emptied 4 saddles. The enemy retired farther and had time to reload, with Barrett followed them up, calling on his men to follow him, unquote. Barrett and Private George Johnson died in a flurry of shots. Private S. Leonard died of his wounds during the night, and Private William C. Tobin was badly wounded. 2 other Union troopers, James Botsford and Peter Glenn, were less seriously injured. Though Union soldiers were killed, they were able to capture 3 Confederates, Sergeant Holmes and Private William Dwyer and John W. Hill. As the dust settled, graves were dug in order to bury the dead in their quote blankets and lay them to rest, covering their graves with wild cactus so the wolves would not disturb them, unquote. So there were bodies out in the desert. So that was it. A fast gunfight between 2 very small groups of soldiers, again less than 25 soldiers, that can hardly be called a battle, much less anything that would match what took place out in the east or in the south. Even the location is unknown, as there were no clear location markers to let anyone know where it took place. Decades later, a coffin was uncovered within the Picacho Pass area, but one must remember that troops did not carry coffins when they went out into battle, so there's no way it could have been a coffin of one of these Union soldiers. In fact, the coffin that they uncovered was that of a young woman who had died in the early 1900s. As the remaining Confederate troops fled back to Tucson from Picacho Pass, right, they went back, the Union Army followed suit. There was no real winner at Picacho Pass, but in the end, the U.S. forces, the Union forces, resumed their advance and drove the Confederate out of Arizona a little over a month later, and they never returned, thus ending the South's 9-month tenure in Arizona and New Mexico. The whole event would later be reconstructed to fit a Southern narrative because as the years passed, the number of troops in the battlefield ballooned. The way troops that were described followed those narratives of the East, with soldiers wearing their blue and gray uniforms, when in reality they wore whatever they had on, mostly wearing, quote, a destitute of clothing, unquote, not the clean and polished uniforms that we see in the East Coast. People that were not there somehow got tied into this story. For example, Lieutenant Jack Swilling, one of the founders of Phoenix, was placed in the scene as leader of the Confederate Army, even though he was nowhere near this event. Ultimately, the skirmish did take place, and this is the best way we can kind of describe it, right, as a skirmish. It was not a battle, but just a few people fighting, so calling it the, quote, westernmost battle of the Civil War. It's not only a bit of a stretch, but also a lie, as there was another event that took place 100 miles west at the Stanwix Station. To call it a battle is more fantasy than reality. So here in this picture, you see the reenactments, and again, they bring in a lot of people for something that was only a few people. And like I said, the battle was here. There was another battle over here somewhere. So it really wasn't the westernmost battle of the Civil War. But you know, we want to feel important. So somehow we got to tie ourselves into this Civil War narrative. So let's examine the significance of the battle. So why is this event important to us today here in Arizona? Much of it has to do with contemporary culture, trying to incorporate their identity with major historical events. This is very common. Look at how we make genealogies, right? Historical genealogies with your last name, where we think we all descend from, King Charlemagne or some important medieval king, when in reality our ancestors were probably just peasants, right? So, but we like to think, yeah, my great 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 whatever was the king of England or something, right? Was some knight. So historian L. Boyd Finch argues this very point, that this skirmish allowed, quote, Arizonians to link their past to the trauma of the Great Conflict, allowing the state to join the national narrative, unquote. A second reason why this happened has to do with the growth of migration in the following century, after the Civil War. Recall that migration took place from east to west, so some ex-Civil War veterans moved west with their families, bringing ancestral organizations such as the Daughters of the American Revolution or the Daughters of the Confederacy. And then once they settled here, trying to construct a fictional past in their new homeland. As noted earlier, most of those that supported the Confederacy in Arizona were not Confederate people, but rather territorialists who had no slaves and no interest in East Coast issues. A third reason, a very important one, is the lost cause ideology. So this is a Southern argument, which for many Southerners became almost like a, quote, civil religion, unquote, arguing that, quote, white Southerners fought for states' rights, not slavery, that Confederate soldiers were neither traitors nor rebels, but patriots defending the U.S. Constitution, and that they had demonstrated skill, virtue, and bravery on the battlefield, but were ultimately defeated by overwhelming numbers and resources, thus rejecting the term, quote, war of the rebellion, in favor of, quote, war between the states, unquote. So let's examine how this almost pointless battle became such a major event in Arizona history. So a great example of this, of how history gets whitewashed would be something like the Crusades. So if you ever study the Crusades, there were like about 9 of them. And with the exception of the first one, they were all failures. The Muslims completely destroyed any Christian crusaders. But as you see today, a lot of kind of extremists like to link, themselves with, the crusaders, those medieval soldiers who went and fought for Christianity in the Middle East. And, why would you align yourself with a bunch of losers? Or, well, it's that it's become romanticized, right? And so even though, the Crusades were a complete failure, today we hold them in great value, like, oh, well, these were brave soldiers who gave their life for Christianity. This is the same thing. The lost cause is the same kind of illogical thinking that's happening here. So let's look at what happened. So, I talked about Picacho Pass and the actual event, right? Again, the Union won. Confederate really didn't control this place. It was controlled for the majority of time by the Union. But things will kind of change. So we're going to look at post-Civil War era in Arizona. So as the Confederacy was ejected from Arizona, their existence almost seemed to disappear because their time in Arizona was so short-lived. Remember that they only occupied Tucson for a few months, while the Union controlled it for the majority of the time thereafter. However, it is important to note that almost all those that resided in Arizona in the post-Civil War era did not even know or cared about this event. So it was almost like forgotten. In fact, throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, Arizona was dominated by a more pro-Union sentiment since many had fought in the Civil War and settled in the state. By the 1880s, ex-Union soldiers established the Grand Army of the Republic, posts throughout the state, which helped with supporting former Union soldiers and to commemorate their involvement in the war. However, by the 1900s, we saw Confederate organizations begin to establish roots in Arizona, but they tended to be much smaller in numbers, such as the United Confederate Veterans, and were not visible in public events such as in parades or memorial events. As these Civil War soldiers passed away, their children took up the torch in remembering their fathers and grandfathers. However, it was mostly dominated by former Union members. Organizations such as the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War and the Union Women's Relief Corps continued the memory of their loved ones by, quote, participating in parades, Memorial Day services, community gatherings, and other commemorative activities, many of which consciously sought to attach the territory to a larger national narrative, unquote. Schools were named after Union military people in Tucson, such as Roscoe Elementary and the former John Spring Elementary. There were monuments erected at a much smaller scale than in the East Coast, as Harry Stone recalled that in December 1927, he saw a wooden cross commemorating the death and assumed gravesite of Lieutenant Barrett and comrades who had died at Picacho Pass, supposedly placed in its location in 1915. This forced him to act, and with government support, the, quote, community of Tucson quickly embraced the initiative to build a monument at Picacho Pass, near the spot where the Union heroes fell in the only, quote unquote, battle fought in Arizona during the Civil War, unquote. On April 15, 1928, on the 66th anniversary of the, quote, Battle of Picacho Pass, they placed a, quote, hewn of the native rocks, unquote, with a marker. The event was celebrated with a ceremony that emphasized loyalty, union, and really the union, patriotism, sacrifice, and freedom. The participants, including several children and grandchildren of Civil War veterans, evoked pro-union sentiment as they solemnly memorialized the dead at Picacho Pass, unquote. Unfortunately, this excitement for Arizona's ties to the U.S. Civil War seemed to quickly diminish, which probably had to do with the Great Depression and the war, which happened in the 40s. Because by the late 1930s, the memorial seemed to have, quote, fallen into obscurity, unquote. So how did a pro-Union state move away from its roots and reinvent the Picacho Pass skirmish into a Confederate event in our state? So here you see what happened in 1928, right? All these people gathering, again, very pro-Union. And here again, other events that are pro-Union. So why, how did it go from that to something that's more kind of celebrating the Confederacy? So the context of this shift from a pro-Union to a Confederate position is not based on fact, but rather on those that dominated the narrative. If we examine the Picacho Pass skirmish, though the Union did lose 3 men, 3 actually died at this event, they did end up capturing Confederate soldiers at this event, and the remaining left their posts and returned to Tucson, right? The remaining Confederates, only to lose the town a few months later. So we clearly see that the Confederate lost. However, in the post-1950s, one would think that Arizona was a Confederate state for the majority of the war, and that we had a, quote, Southern culture, unquote, here with Southern bells and plantations in this dry desert Southwest. So we looked at what happens after the war, again, very pro-Union, and now by the 1950s, it becomes a very kind of Southern celebration here in Arizona. Again, only being held by the Confederate for a few months. So it's really around the 1950s where the U.S. went through a population shift with white Southerners moving into Arizona in the post-war period, bringing with them, quote, an identity grounded in the constant presence of Confederate symbols, unquote. Though there were already Confederate organizations sprinkled throughout the state, most had a minimal number of members, such as the United Daughters of the Confederacy. But they really had no say in those early years. In fact, They asked to participate in the 1928 memorial event, but were denied participation and instead formed a committee in order to dedicate part of the US 70 to Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, here in Arizona. This move was to present not what took place in Arizona, but rather to whitewash and provide a revisionist interpretation of events. What these new transplants did was what historian Chris Bradley calls the Confederate fantasy heritage, transforming what took place in Arizona to not only incorporate it into the larger American historical context, but to retell the story of Picacho Pass that aligned with the lost cause narrative. In fact, a clear example is when the Arizona Daily Press on April 20th, 1958 wrote an article claiming that the quote, the South shall rise again at Picacho, unquote, and quoted a SCV member that, quote, Confederate soldiers of about 8 faced a force of nearly 300 U.S. volunteers, unquote, which was a complete lie. Remember, only about 25 people were there, not these exaggerated numbers that these people begin to tell. However, the Confederate members had completely dominated Arizona's Civil War memory and were able to even fly the Confederate battle flag over the Arizona state capitol on January 8, 1961, along with placing a monument to Confederate soldiers on the southeastern corner of the state's capitol grounds. All this was part of the centennial anniversary celebration of the U.S. Civil War, and it culminated with a ball with the hall at the Ramada Inn decorated, quote, into an antebellum flower garden with mesquite trees converted into flowering peach trees in a mural of a mansion looking into a garden, unquote. In other words, the celebration was not celebrating the Union's win, but rather a Confederate illusion. The coup de grace came with the Confederate monument at Picacho Pass. As noted earlier, the original, more pro-Union monument had been forgotten and neglected. With Confederate organizations in Arizona taking control of the quote-unquote battle, it is no coincidence that Arizona saw itself as a, quote, southern, unquote, state by the centennial. As people gathered to celebrate the anniversary of the battle and really of the U.S. Civil War, the, quote, Arizona Civil War Centennial Commission, which was dominated by pro-Confederate leadership, recruited more than 100 reenactors, 4 times the numbers involved in the actual engagement, and expanded the event's storyline, unquote. As we got closer to the 1960s, neoconservative festivities ramped up. For example, on April 27, 1958, the grandson of Confederate General John Taylor, quote, presided over the dedication of the memorial and proclaimed that, quote, now we can say Arizona has the remembrance of its Confederate past, unquote. At this event, 9 women from the UDC, quote, laid a wreath in honor of the mythical rebel combatants, while the band from the Amphitheater High School in Tucson played Dixie, unquote. The Sons of the Confederate Veterans placed, quote, a flagstone base supporting a large redwood plaque inscribed with the story of the westernmost battle of the Civil War, unquote, implementing the lost cause argument that sugarcoated the reality of what took place. More importantly, this new Confederate monument took a much more prominent and visible position aside a rest stop, which overtook the old Union Memorial. In 1968, the, quote, state of Arizona opened a park at Picacho Peak, west of I-10, and overlooking Picacho Pass, unveiling a new wooden marker, unquote. Though many pro-Confederate memorials continued throughout the 70s and 80s, the issue that arose is that Arizona had completely whitewashed historical facts and replaced them with a Confederate heritage fantasy that glossed over not only the actual event, but the way it was interpreted for decades. It shows that even when a treasonous act takes place, it can easily be replaced by a few vocal organizations that promote a false narrative. Arizona was not the South, yet these organizations such as the Sons of the Confederacy and the UDC were successful in making people believe that we not only participated in the Civil War, but were pro-Confederate. It is easy to manipulate the past with sprinkles of events in order to justify our agenda, and the skirmish at Picacho Pass clearly shows how decades uh, after the event, the mythical Southern past, which has been highly romanticized in our American history. I mean, just think of Disney and the way Song of the South romanticizes the the South, even gain a foothold in our own local history, in a place where slavery did not exist. The Confederate had an insignificant presence, and where our geological landscape looked nowhere like any Southern state. So here you see, right, again, the celebration in 1962, and these women look like Southern belles, and have establishing the memorial, not having the Dixie flag, and um, again, we're trying to present ourselves as though we were somehow part of the South for the majority of the war. So what did we learn? Hopefully, you walk away with something new. That first of all, this battle was more of a skirmish. It wasn't a battle like it was in the East Coast, like Gettysburg and all that type of stuff. It was just a few people shooting it out, and the South was quickly kicked out of Arizona territory. But that changes. 100 years after, they romanticize, particularly us as a people, romanticize the South, right? We Gone with the Wind, and again Disney rides, and so forth, begin to romanticize the way we look at our past. And Arizona begins to see itself in that way too. A lot of it has to do again with Southern people migrating and settling in Arizona in the post 50 period. And unfortunately, that went against reality. So here are some works that I cited in case you want to read more. There's a great piece right here that looks at also Native American involvement. I just didn't have the time to incorporate that here, but some great articles that address what happened here. And I know we do have a history of Arizona, and it's funny because their textbook doesn't even mention this event. It just goes to show how minor it was. But again, if you were to ask somebody in the 50s, you would think that Arizona played the most important role in this major in the outcome of this major event. All right, so we'll stop it there, and I hope you feel like you learned something new about your state.